We need to look up and put that phone away.
We need to teach youth to be critical of what they read and see, especially on the internet.
And you might imagine that what children watch actually is important. And so content would be key.
Make a human connection, teach human interaction as if it were as important as the very breath we breathe.
They really feel as if this is one world.
But as we see what this generation looks like as it grows up with it, they're now a generation in retreat. They'll text, but they won't talk. This is no longer a generation that lives deliberately, that lives its life, that lives in the moment. I think that has time for reflection. We ask ourselves questions. If the velocity and volume is such that I send you a tweet, or I send you a text, you have to answer me back. You can't. Nobody answers a text by saying, I have to think about that for 2 weeks. The communication demands a response. Well, that means that we start to ask each other questions that are easy to answer. The world is more and more and more and more complex. On the other hand, we're only going to ask you a question that you can answer in 2 seconds. So we leave ourselves less and less time for reflection because our communications media push us to quick responses. And quite frankly, the questions before our planet right now are not questions that should be answered or thought about in the time space of texting. These kids don't want to see a face, they don't want to see a voice. They want to text, so that in a way we're no longer nourished but consumed in some way by what we've created. And I think that's very, it's not all good. It's not all good.
I think one of the things that has happened to the first generation of kids to grow up always being online, which by the way are my kids. They have never experienced dial-up or anything like that. They've always had always on. And what I've seen is they have a global awareness that was not present in my generation. They also feel as if they are always connected to everyone else. There is a feeling of being connected that I did not have in my generation. And I think the third thing is that there is a sense of movement forward, the sense of going somewhere, of maybe we might call it progress, that I think was not present in previous generations.
Do you think that generations growing up, the new generation growing up with the web, think differently from other generations?
Well, it's clear that even people who have, like me, who started off without the web and now use it, work differently. When we want to think of something, we tend to often just reach for the keyboard because we have assumed that we can find stuff. Now people say, I don't know, but that they've measured that people are not remembering so much. I don't know, but I know that the way I work very often assumes that I can go for my computer helper.
There are now people in their mid to getting on to advanced teens who have never known, obviously, a world without the web. In fact, there may be 20-year-olds who've never known anything about that. Have they developed strange thumbs? Do they have peculiar ways of talking and listening? Do their eyes glaze over when they have to concentrate for more than 30 seconds? No, I don't believe any of that. I'm not particularly negative or pessimistic about the social qualities, the linguistic qualities, the concentration qualities of Generation Web, as they're called.
I think we already see, my experience of this is we already see students who have a very acute sense of the requirement to be critical about the material they're seeing. Just because the web is full of a huge amount of material, some of questionable provenance and origin, they have to take those lessons on board very early. So in a strange way, although there is more out there, it's requiring them to be more self-critical about how they should use those sources. And I think that's a hugely important skill in thinking that we've always been trying to convey to students.
I honestly believe that if you were to go back into the 1920s and take an ordinary, semi-educated 15-year-old and place him next to an ordinary, semi-educated 15-year-old now, you would find the one now knows more, understands more, is more socially confident, is more aware of the rest of the world, is more able and more adept at research, may not be able to say their 9 times table as fluently or repeat amo amasamata mamasamati amant. They may not be able to do that. Is that such a great loss to an old-fashioned person like me? I'd love to think people could do both.
How do you feel when you see new students coming through? Do you identify them as being more curious, more intelligent, more smarter, more critical?
Well, I'm a professor of computer science, so I see people who naturally want to get in and develop the systems, take them to the limits, and their whole interest in doing this and ability to do it is hugely accelerated by the presence of the web, because they can form communities, they can exploit open source software movements, they can be much more creative individually than they would be, collectively than they would be on their own.
I have made quite a lot of online friends. I don't even know what gender some of them are. They're people I chat with, either personal direct messaging in forums and Twitter and so on. Some of whom I think are very young, you can sort of tell they are, and who astonish me occasionally with their knowledge of literature. In fact, I was having a conversation just the other day with one who was talking to me about Evelyn Waugh, and I think she's 12, and she seems to have read every book that Evelyn Waugh ever wrote and have a very intelligent view of this great novelist. And I almost wanted to say, but how would someone who's 12 like you ever have read these books? And I think, what am I saying? Of course they might have done, and spend a lot of their time on a forum as well. It's not, the two are not mutually exclusive.
So Nigel, let's just start and talk about some of the issues of Programme 4. Do you think that the social networking revolution has irrevocably changed our relationships, how young people relate to each other?
I think it's provided a means to stay connected at much closer quarters for much longer periods of time. So classically, the statement is that the kids bring the playground back with them in the evening. So in a sense, their local friendship groups are more persistent, they last longer, and that brings benefits and disbenefits, I think.
What's going on online is, in many ways, it's youth space. So they're there, they're goofing around as though they're there just with their friends. And so what ends up happening is you can get a sense of what's going on really in broad sweeps. And it isn't just the kids like the kids in your community, but the kids who are in different communities all around the world with all sorts of different ideas of what is normative behavior, right? And that what is normal, what is common really differs. And so we see these behaviors online and we're like, oh my gosh, it's radically different today than it ever was before. It's not really.
Well, I was going to ask that actually. How different is it from like when I was a kid, I'd come to the mall and I'd do stuff at the mall, or I'd go to the movie theater or whatever. How different is it?
Think about what happens when you were doing that with your friends, right? You were there, you were joking around, you were gossiping, you were flirting, you were kind of consuming culture and consuming merchandise, but it was part of this all-encompassing social experience. The same thing is actually happening fully online, right? So all of those everyday practices, the gossip, the flirting, the joking around, that's taking place online. And it's taking place online with the same kinds of friends that took place in the mall, right? You met up with all the kids at school, but you also saw the kids at the neighboring school, and you're like, hey, who are you? What's that about? That same thing is where we're seeing it play out. So young people who are engaged online, they're primarily engaged with the people they already know. They're friends from school, they're friends from after-school activities, they're friends from around the community.
Well, it's clear that within friendship groups with teenagers and people at school, there's a huge appetite for staying connected, to stay available through and beyond the school day. But of also some of the problems of the playground come back, I suspect, into the home, into the kind of sanctuary they used to have. So there's a sense in which their space is sort of invaded. Of course, they're all willing participants and accomplices in this, but it gives them perhaps not as much opportunity for downtime where they're not under those sorts of stresses.
Yeah, we're seeing patterns, and a lot of it has to do with their particular social positions, right? So the popular kids are using the technologies to try to maintain and reinforce popularity in very particular ways, and that's when we see social status becoming really critical. So it's no longer the Nikes that are the particular status markers. It's the way of actually maintaining certain kinds of friendships and getting certain kinds of responses from certain celebrities. All of that play goes on. We also see marginalized kids who were desperately seeking some sort of support, and were often at loss, out in more traditional senses of schools or whatnot, finding a community online. And this is one of the more powerful narratives of the internet, right? Your queer kids who can actually find people like them who can support them. They're much more willing to be public in a traditional sense because they're desperate for somebody who might be like them. For the popular kid, it's much more about being public to the school, people who will give them credit, that will give them status. And so we see these different groups contending with it differently.
The web gives us a new kind of instrumentation, I think. It is a new golden age in the sense that obviously you're joining people together. So on the end of all of these web connections are on the order of, hundreds of millions of neurons whirring away with a life history that can be shared and pooled. That integration of human intelligence has never been seen before on this scale. And what's happening with the web is one of its characteristics is that those communities within the web coalesce, aggregate, come together to form particular interest groups. So it seems to self-organize in very interesting ways into coordinated groups of communities.
Sherry, how is this generation different in terms of how much we give to other people in terms of our information?
Well, I think this generation has a sense that information wants to be free and information about themselves wants to be free.
We're also proud of our youth. We think our youth and our childhood was somehow, if not perfect, it was, even if it was imperfect, it made us suffer. How dare these children now not suffer the way I did? They should be having the kind of life I did, made to read, made to do this. They should not have this freedom, this access. Or if they do, while I can approve of it, I ought to suggest that it's dangerous, that it's going to go wrong.
People put their lives on the screen. They put really intimate details of their lives out there, and with very little thought that there might be people using that information in ways that are not benign. And in a way, there's a kind of self-surveillance that I think that young people don't think about in political terms. But it is a political issue.
How are kids exchanging or using private information as currency in a different way than perhaps adults are using private information as currency?
Well, again, what constitutes private information, right? From an adult's perspective, it's identifying information as their absolute fear, right? The idea that it's your name, your address, your phone number, anything that will identify you. And this has to do with the idea of physical risk. But for young people, it's about all right, fine, you can call me by my name. Why is that a big deal? It's more about the things that make you vulnerable. And so when we think about privacy and private information, it's really a question of vulnerability. And so from an adult perspective, we're really concerned about physical vulnerabilities and increasingly about psychological vulnerabilities. And for a lot of young people, it's about social vulnerabilities. So, how do I make certain that I don't get teased, harassed, bullied because of the things that I make available out there? How do I make certain that what I put out there makes me seem cool and not lame? How do I balance that? So the social vulnerability is the privacy fight for young people. The physical and psychological is the fight for parents. And so we see these two constantly at odds, because part of putting things out in public is to achieve status, you need to actually make yourself vulnerable at a certain level. And how do you actually do that in a way that balances the risks and the benefits?
I did an interview with a 16-year-old that is precious to me, because he talked about how he knows that people can read his email. He knows that people, somehow he senses that his texts are being saved in some server in the sky. But when he wants to have a private conversation, he goes to payphones. And he feels that payphones are the only safe place for him to talk. I mean, you have this sense of even young people looking for the interstices of the system to find a little privacy. I don't think this is good. I think that it's hard to teach the relationship between privacy and democracy, and it's also hard to teach the relationship between intimacy and privacy. What is intimacy without privacy? I think this is really a question for this generation.
But let's get real about this. Connection is what humans crave.